Welcome. It's 6 o'clock. This is the beginning of a three-part series that will be hosted jointly by the Baltimore City Delegation and the Prince George's County Delegation. And the first installment is entitled, What is the Law Enforcement Officer's Bill of Rights, also known as LEOBOR? We know it's just the 6 o'clock hour. We want to give enough time for those that are going to join us to assemble, and then we will begin with greetings in just a moment. Thank you for spending a part of your evening with us. We want to make the best use of this hour. So we're going to begin by just having some initial remarks from some of our participants, particularly my fellow Chairman Erek Barron of Prince George's County. He will be joining, giving a welcome rather to all of you today. So you might be asking yourself, why are we coming together as two delegations? Baltimore City and Prince George's County have a lot of commonalities. We have a history of strained relationships between community members and law enforcement, and a desire to overcome those challenges. There is also a commonality being the largest majority African American jurisdictions in the state of Maryland. So we have a very special stake in improving relationships between the community and law enforcement, and also making sure that those who do not live up to their responsibilities are held accountable under the law. So one of the conversations that we know many people would like to have is how can that accountability be actualized? So I want to bring greetings on behalf of the full Baltimore City delegation to all who are hearing my voice, be it constituents, friends from Prince George's County, or anyone that's listening from across Maryland, because this is an issue that ties all of us together across Maryland. I want to give opportunity for Chairman Erek Barron of Prince George's County to also bring greetings.
Good evening, and thank you, Chair Smith. Again, my name is Erek Barron. I represent Legislative District 24 in the Maryland General Assembly. Again, I am chair of the Prince George's County House Delegation, and I bring you greetings on behalf of the delegation. First, I want to thank my colleague, Delegate Smith, for leading the way in organizing this important discussion and reaching out to our delegation. As she said, we obviously have a shared interest in this topic, and this is one of the many efforts to educate the public and interested policymakers about what this law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights is, and how does it impact allegations of misconduct and impact the relationship between law enforcement and the community that it serves. Second, I want to point out that there are other ongoing efforts and sources of information. The House of Delegates Speaker Adrian Jones has established a work group to review potential policing reforms. In Prince George's County, County Executive Angela Alsobrooks has also established a police reform work group chaired by Delegate Alonzo Washington. And in the Maryland Senate, Chairman Will Smith has announced that he will be holding hearings this fall regarding specific policing reform proposals. And so finally, I want to thank all of you out there who are active and paying attention and taking the time to educate yourselves and others about how we can work towards a better relationship between public safety professionals and the communities they serve, and just make sure that as we are engaging in potential policy changes, that as many people and constituents and neighbors out there know what these provisions are that we're all talking about, and the highlights and everything that you see in the newspaper and the conversations that are having on TV. So with that, I'll pass it back to Chair Smith.
Thank you so much. So I want to just take a moment. Can everyone see me and hear my voice? Great. I want to take a moment to say that we're going to share a little bit of content with you all, but then we're really going to have a discussion between our panelists about the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. At the conclusion of their conversation will be an opportunity for some questions to be provided from the public. So I wanted to direct you to the chat feature within Facebook Live. That is where you will see some information being provided, particularly some of the information that Delegate Barron shared around the House Police Accountability Work Group. Those links will be provided within that feed so that you can continue to monitor those activities and participate as well. So I just want to share a little bit of content. Now, Delegate Barron, you mentioned that people are hearing some things in the news. I wanted you to kind of expound a bit on what that means. Hold on, make sure everyone can see that.
Sure. So, in our state, in Prince George's and Baltimore, and beyond, Montgomery County and beyond, and pretty much every jurisdiction, I think, has had some discourse about police misconduct and the scope of accountability that your local police department has, the scope of transparency, and how when misconduct happens or allegations of misconduct happen, what's the policy and the law and regulations surrounding how those allegations are administered. What due process rights does an accused have in that context, and what rights do citizens have to know what's going on, and to make sure that officers and their department are acting appropriately.
Thank you. So I know that we've seen, as you've noted, a lot of conversations in the public about LEOBOR, and maybe for those that are listening to this conversation for the first time, you wanted to know, well, where did this come from? Where, Maryland is actually is the entity that started the conversation around the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, because we were the very first state to adopt one, and that was in 1974. And what sometimes people don't know about that beginning is that it wasn't necessarily a law that was well received as a proposal across the state. The city of Baltimore was experiencing challenges with their commissioner at the time and rank and file police officers who felt that they were vulnerable to unjust transfer, unjust termination, and felt that there needed to be some additional protections provided because of their role in society and because of the relationship between command at that time and the rank and file. So delegates from the city of Baltimore were the chief champions of the proposal to establish the state's Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. At that time, it was reported that other jurisdictions, particularly some of our larger jurisdictions like Montgomery County, Howard County, and Frederick County, were not interested in actually being subjected to the proposal as first conceived as a statewide law. As we all know, it did become a statewide law. And ever since then, there has been episodic challenges and voices raised around what that really means on the ground for community members in terms of police accountability for injustices that residents have experienced across the state. So I'm going to stop sharing my content, and we're going to begin having a conversation about what it really means to have not just the first law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights, but one that is quite notable in some of its key provisions. The fact that this is a law that discusses not only who investigates allegations of misconduct, how those investigations are formed and experienced, the duration of even the investigations are all subject to the law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights. So I think the public is often wondering, either at the county or city level, how can they be more involved in the accountability conversation? Well, the law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights also creates parameters under which civilians can be engaged in that oversight. So when you consider that this is a law that sets the stage for how police officers are investigated, who does the investigating, what the investigating looks like, how it's experienced, and how civilians can be involved, it's very important for all of our constituents to really understand what that can mean for the safety of their community and for their ability to have quality relationships with law enforcement. So before we jump into our conversation, I want to make sure that our panelists have an opportunity to share with all of you who they are, their relationship to this work, and then we'll have a really robust and engaging discussion. So I would first like to introduce Senator Jill Carter of the 41st District in Northwest Baltimore, and to share. Thank you so much, Senator, for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Chair Smith and Chair Barron and everyone that's joining us. It's always a pleasure to be asked to talk about this subject. It's become such a hot topic now. It bothers me immensely that we are in 2020 continuing to deal with issues around our need to reform police and policing. I was in 2014 and 2015 a sponsor of legislation that would not have repealed the LEOBR, even though that's what I would have preferred. But in working with advocates, we decided that it was important to reform the LEOBR, to alter it, to modify it in certain ways, some that you've talked about. And what are those ways? What are those things? And so, first, let me just make it clear. Everybody at this point has heard about the Gun Trace Task Force. The Gun Trace Task Force, it is my position that the Gun Trace Task Force would have never been allowed to exist had LEOBR not been in place to protect them. Why? Because there were multiple allegations of misconduct raised by civilians over the period of time that they were in operation. But the internal affairs process completely ignored those allegations and or conducted a cursory investigation and came to the conclusion that no misconduct existed. At the very same time, the Baltimore Civilian Review Board also received some complaints on some of the officers involved in the Gun Trace Task Force. And the Civilian Review Board came to conclusions that misconduct had been committed. But because they had no power to implement their recommendations on discipline, nothing ever happened until the feds came in and said, this complete criminal enterprise, these RICO operators within policing have committed all of these crimes. So I'll explain that just a little bit more, because people say, well, why are police policing themselves? Well, because with the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights in place, civilians don't have any ability to interrogate or investigate or enact discipline. So even if there's a legitimate civilian oversight entity or civilian review board in place, as there is in Baltimore City, that board has no authority to interrogate an officer that's the subject of a misconduct complaint, to investigate any complaints that are outside the scope of their very narrow 5 categories of allegations they're allowed to investigate. And even if they are allowed to investigate, at the conclusion, if they conclude misconduct existed, excessive force happened, they can simply make that recommendation to the police department, who doesn't have to honor or adhere to their recommendation at all. And what's significant is that the police department never does, okay? Yes, they can talk about 1 or 2 or 3 instances where they adhere to the recommendations of the Civilian Review Board, but in all of those instances, it was impossible for the officer to receive discipline because the officers had resigned or died by the time this was finally concluded. And what is significant there is that we talk about what I want to be clear about is we need to reimagine policing. It does not in its current form, and it frankly hasn't worked for a very long time. In 1974, Richard Nixon was the president. Marvin Mandel was the governor of the state of Maryland. Mike Miller was elected to the Maryland Senate. Okay, that's the climate that was going on politically when the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights came into place. It's also important that since 1974, our labor laws have greatly expanded and improved. Our protections of all employees that have an interest in their jobs have expanded. And so many of the things that were probably initially thought were needed by the law enforcement officers, basically many of those things have improved and expanded for all employees over the time. But now we have a dual system, a two-tiered system, where everybody else has their regular due process rights and the law enforcement officers have their special set of privileges. Those privileges, the most significant ones that we talk about are the fact that when an officer is accused of misconduct or seen on a video doing something, which quite often happens, and the police department decides that they have no choice, usually is what happens because it's seen on camera, to conduct an investigation, the officer has, it used to be 10 days under our law, but 5 days to get the story together, to get counsel. After examining, reviewing their entire file, witnesses, every bit of evidence potentially accrued against them, then they give their statement administratively. And that's deemed an unreasonable amount of time. Nobody else enjoys that kind of privilege. What is also important is that more often than not, officers hire counsel. Counsel says we need more time, and even that 5 days is often expanded. So people talk about 5 days, 10 days. Usually it could be 30 days, 40 days, 50 days, whatever. Another thing is important, the interaction, the interplay between the administrative investigations and the criminal investigations. Oftentimes I find people get those confused. 99% of the time, if an officer is charged criminally, which is unusual, the administrative proceeding halts and waits until the conclusion of that. Finally, and I'll stop after this and be available for any questions. What you talked about is the two issues that we've been talking about for several years around law enforcement are the need for accountability and the need for transparency. Until we have those things, nothing will ever change. We cannot even begin to reform law enforcement without that accountability and transparency. The Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights is an impediment to both. It is an impediment to accountability because one, there's no right of independent non-law enforcement officers to investigate allegations of misconduct. There is also a dual shielding, so to speak, between that and our Public Information Act. And what that does is it does not allow the disclosure of disciplinary records. And so, I can tell you that a lot of times we saw with George Floyd and Officer Chauvin, he had multiple, I think it was 20 some prior allegations. We see that all the time with the Gun Trace Task Force, with Wayne Jenkins. He had multiple allegations of misconduct, but that is protected under our current law and not disclosed to the public. It is not even disclosed to defense counsel. So if you're preparing a case and your client is saying, he beat me up, he did this, defense counsel, unless there's certain circumstances in place, files a motion, but it's usually protected, can't even get the information on the background of the officer. In addition to that, the civilian review boards and oversight entities are also prohibited from getting that background information on the officer's record of discipline. And so it is my position that we need to repeal the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. And I'll tell you that as we set the tone in this country in 1974 and other jurisdictions followed, now we are trailing because other jurisdictions, for the most part, are working toward removing these kinds of laws in their state. If we do not do it now, we're actually going to be very behind. We're already in a minority of states that still has it. But since, the recent June outbreak of protest and need to reform, many other states and jurisdictions have legislation in place now to repeal their law enforcement, their whatever they have that's analogous to Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights.
Thank you so much, Senator. I know there's so much information you were compressing into, so we'll be able to touch on anything you want to go into deeper detail, as we continue to have our conversation. I want to now introduce Davon Love. He is the Policy Director for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and I'll give him opportunity to explain kind of his relationship as a grassroots activist to this work and what it means on the ground for people that are concerned about police accountability. Thank you for being with us.
All right, thank you for the invitation. Good evening, everybody on the panel and everybody watching. So I just want to say a few things. So Senator Carter did, I think, a great job of laying out the mechanics of the LEOBR and its implications on how it impacts how law enforcement is operationalized in the community. I think it's important. Oftentimes there's a frame that is used in many mainstream spaces as it relates to law enforcement and police brutality, this frame of police community relations and how do we improve the relationship between police and community. And I think it's important to reframe that notion. Similar to some of the history that Senator Carter, began to reference, the LEOBR emerges during a time when the counterintelligence program, which was revealed through the Church Commission in 1972, so this isn't conspiracy theories, we're collaborating with local law enforcement to undermine Black freedom struggle against the status quo. So whether you're talking about Eddie Conway, who spent 44 years, former member of the Black Panther Party of Self-Defense, that spent 44 years in prison in Maryland as a political prisoner, the political assassination of Fred Hampton in Chicago in 1969, whether you're talking about the framing of Assata Shakur and the Fraternal Order of Police continued support of her extradition. I bring up that history because I think oftentimes there's this fantasy that law enforcement at one point had this romantic relationship to the Black community. And in fact, law enforcement as an institution was complicit in, at best, and at worst, was an active agent at undermining the quality of life of Black people and undermining the efforts that Black people have waged to address the social inequality and injustice that is fundamental to the society that we live in. That's important because the LEOBR emerges in a context where this is happening. So a part of what we're seeing currently in terms of the LEOBR as it's currently constituted, and again, Senator Carter mentioned only sworn law enforcement can be involved in an investigation of allegation of misconduct. Officers are entitled to all the information that's going to be used against them in the administrative hearing boards. These are all the kinds of protections that you would give an institution, right, that is engaged in behavior that it doesn't want the general public to be privy to. And because of the way in which law enforcement is cast, and again, this kind of romantic sentiment in public culture and in popular culture, oftentimes the notion of police officers and the inherent goodness of them is often taken for granted. And those who challenge that notion, because if you know the history of how law enforcement has addressed Black people, then the popular notion of how law enforcement and police officers are rendered are nonsensical to us. Like the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense that was formed in October of 1966 in Oakland, California, one of the first things they worked on was patrolling the police who were engaged in police brutality of folks in the community. Right. That is the actual relationship that law enforcement has had with the Black community. So what makes the LEOBR so important is because so what we shouldn't be talking about is how do we improve the relationship between police and community. The fundamental question is community control and oversight over law enforcement. Right. One of the impacts that the notion of racism and white supremacy as kind of a guiding logic of American civil society, it creates this notion that Black people shouldn't be entitled to control the institutions that governs our lives, right? And so what the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights does is that it blocks the important mechanisms necessary for the community to exercise the kind of control over a major institution that has the power to end a person's life or to cause substantial injury to someone in the community. And so, as I mentioned, Senator Carter, I think, did a great job of laying out the very specific mechanics of how the LEOBR undermines the ability for law enforcement to be a force of good in our communities. And the last thing I'll say on this is that I think a part of what we need to be clear about is that there will be many different, a part of when we think about, like, what do people say on the ground? It's conventional knowledge on the ground that police have been engaged in brutality of the community. I remember in 2015 being told about some of the things that eventually came out through the federal trial of the gun trace task force, right? And one of the things that I was told was that, and some of these conversations actually happened in Annapolis with people that came to testify, who said that if I say what I know, no one's going to believe me, right? Because the overwhelming kind of notion of law enforcement as, faultless made it difficult for people to believe it. It took a federal investigation for people to believe it. And so on the ground, people may not know all of the particular mechanics of what the issue is, but what people are clear about is policing themselves. Unless that's changed, nothing else will change. And that is the bottom line in terms of any law enforcement legislation that's put forward that is serious. Fundamental to it is policing themselves, and LEOBR is a statutory iteration of police being given the power to police and discipline themselves. And so this is where we are. This is why LEOBR is so central.
Thanks, Davon. Oftentimes, we don't hear enough in this conversation the perspective of law enforcement officers of color, for one, and the Maryland Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights in a national context. So I'm really happy that we have our next guest here with us, Mr. Joseph McMillan, who has a long and distinguished career in law enforcement and is a past president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Officers. So with that, Mr. McMillan, could you introduce that organization to us and give us your perspective?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Good evening. I appreciate the ability to offer a few comments as part of this panel. To that extent, I want to first state that as a past president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, I'm going to identify areas where my comments are mine and those that represent the organization separately. First, let me state that if we can't see a problem, we can't fix a problem. Policing is a profession with the expectation of high standards, and there's minimal areas for not getting a situation right. To that extent, we must ask ourselves, then what's presented before us is an awesome ability to reimagine policing in the 21st century. And what does true reforms look like? Will we tinker around those edges, or will we roll up our sleeves and tackle what seems to be some of the most intractable issues that demand our attention? This approach aligns with Nelson Mandela, former president of South Africa, who stated, was quoted as saying, "It always seems impossible until it's done." The National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives has approximately 60 chapters and represents over 3,000 members worldwide that represent the chief executive officers and command level law enforcement officials from federal, state, county, municipal law enforcement agencies and criminal justice practitioners. NOBLE prides itself on being the conscience of law enforcement. Additionally, NOBLE's mission is to ensure equity in the administration of justice, in the provision of public service to all communities, and to serve as the conscience of law enforcement by being committed to justice by action. Our current president, national president, has been quoted as saying, a comprehensive approach is required in addressing the issues of police culture, accountability, and building trust between police agencies and the communities that we have taken an oath to protect and serve. And it's from this platform that NOBLE engaged in supporting and advancing the 21st Century Policing Task Force effort developed by former President Barack Obama to address critical policing issues confronting America. Specifically, NOBLE believes the following: there's a need to establish a clear set of expectations and guidelines that define the accountability and oversight of police to and by all the American people. Secondly, Police disciplinary action, if warranted, needs to be open for public review. And third, there needs to be a systemic understanding that the lack in some cases of transparency and communication by law enforcement authorities helps to create an environment of confusion and mistrust. The 21st Century Policing Task Force identified several pillars to guide law enforcement toward reforms. Specifically, there are 3 of the 6 pillars that touch on the various areas of reforming police culture from a warrior to a guardian mentality. Pillar 1, building trust and legitimacy. Pillar 2, policy and oversight. And Pillar 4, community policing and crime reduction. These areas are supported by Noble, where it takes a position that the ultimate goal in police accountability is to strengthen trust and legitimacy between law enforcement and the community. Additionally, Noble maintains that the first step in restructuring a new policing system is to take immediate steps in strengthening police accountability and building trust within communities. As such, it is from this position that we also take a comprehensive assessment as to whether or not the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights is an area that adversely impacts the ability to achieve accountability for an individual's actions. Secondly, we can begin to tackle the basic question and dissect the issue. From there, we can make an assessment of understanding why is it necessary to have 2 separate and distinct systems for actions committed by those sworn to protect and serve from ordinary citizens. I believe our criminal justice system is designed to function on the belief that there is equity and fairness relative to justice and due process. While both concepts have similarities, there are also polarities operating interoperably and interdependently, and necessitate management when taking on the challenge of reform. The question before us, as I've stated, is first making a determination whether or not a problem exists that adversely impacts the ability to achieve accountability for an individual's actions. I would suggest the answer is yes. As designed, I believe the LEOBR thwarts the ability for those in a position of responsibility to aggressively take action because of procedural impediments that have been codified into statutes. To address this concern, I maintain that a review is needed of both the current appropriateness of such a statute and the process for its implementation. Like myself, Noble believes a review of the LEOBR to analyze equity and appropriateness in its application is appropriate. What might be considered necessary when initially enacted is not necessarily pertinent through perpetuity. On review, one can opine that the LEOBR provides an advantage to police officers in administrative hearings relative to both time and discovery of information. This is a protection or benefit other citizens simply don't have. For example, if an employee at a private firm was accused of misconduct, would they be given an elongated amount of time for an internal interview? Would they receive access to internal witness statements? In all probability, no. There are 2 polarities at play in our discussions of LEOBR and democracy that must be managed: due process versus justice. Also, as a postdoctoral fellow with the Institute of Polarities of Democracy, this is an area I believe necessitates additional study relative to police practices under the LEOBR and its relationship to accountability. And with that, I'll take further questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, Dr. McMillan, for your remarks, your opening remarks. I want to move back a bit to Senator Carter to kind of set the table of what legislative efforts have looked like. You gave a bit of it in your opening, but I think there was you said there were modifications made. That, for example, some people are still hung up on 10 days, 5 days. Could you give a little more meat to some of the efforts specifically to modify LEOBR and where you are now?
Thank you, certainly. So really quickly, though, I just want to say that one of the things that we've heard time and time again is that LEOBR is also used to discriminate internally against Black and women officers, that discipline is not rendered fairly, it is rendered in a discriminatory way. And the issue has been, because of the nature and culture of retaliation within these agencies, Black officers and women officers are often petrified to come forward. So that being said, so all the way back in 2009, this is important because in the summer before the session of 2009, officers from the Vanguard Justice Society, which is a Black law enforcement organization, met with me and asked me, begged me to put in a bill that would create an independent trial board, because they said to me, the trial boards are unfair, that they only bring Black officers to trial board. And even when they do, if they want to get rid of you, they will do it. And we're the ones that are often, terminated. So I brought the bill. And at the time I brought the bill, I got very angry with them because none of them would come to testify. Why? Because they were scared. They were going to be retaliated against. And so the only people that would testify are lawyers that represent officers that would testify about the inequities. And all this bill did is bring about an independent trial board. It was laughed out of the General Assembly. It was never brought to a vote. Later on, we all know that in 2011, Trayvon Martin, and at that time, I took an interest because I was interested in how Black people being killed by police and how this was not really something that anyone was caring about. I knew that it was happening. And so the Malcolm X grassroots organization wrote a report. Every 28 hours in America, a Black man, woman, or child is killed at the hands of law enforcement. Christopher Brown in Baltimore County was strangled to death. He was 17 years old. He was a good student, a great teen, ROTC football star, and life snuffed out in an instant by a Baltimore County police officer. That, coupled with the every 28 hours report, caused me to sponsor a bill called Christopher's Law, which took 2 sessions to pass. And all that bill did, we had to reduce it. We had to focus in on training because discipline was off the table with the General Assembly. The idea of changing discipline was not to be discussed. And so we simply enhanced training on use of force, diversity, persons with disabilities, and life-saving skills. And that was in 2012. By 2014, I wanted to repeal the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. But at this point, I met with different organizations, including ACLU. By this time, LBS was on board. And we put forth the first initiative, like overhaul of LEOBR in 2014. It was ignored. 2015, we came back stronger. Let me tell you about 2015. 2015, we had opening day of session, hundreds of people holding a rally in Lawyers Mall, coming into the House Judiciary Committee, doing an, at that time, occupation to occupy the committee. And Chairman Valerio promised me, he was the chair of the Judiciary, that we would address this issue. Time for hearings, we had hundreds of people come down to testify. Multiple people testifying about how their loved one, child, husband, father, brother, killed by police. Quite often the scenario was we trusted the police, person had a problem, I called the police to alleviate the problem, police killed my son, daughter, child, whatever. What I saw was, first of all, these people were made to wait until 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night, having come down there at 10, 11 o'clock in the morning. Secondly, there was a hostility toward them by, the chair and the vice chair of my committee, the chair and the vice chair walked out of the room by the time that these people came to testify about what happened to the citizens. They stayed for the law enforcement because they put them first. But then when people came to testify, the chair and the vice chair walked out, left the room. People testified to no leadership in the committee at all. And there was hostility when people were talking about how police killed their children, hurt their children, whatever. And they were treated like less than humans. Bottom line is, Chairman Valerio at the time said to me, listen, an agreement was made. We promised law enforcement, FOP, we would never, ever, ever mess with LEOBR. But I was like, but you promised. So Chairman Valerio was like, I want to help you, but the speaker is not going for it. We can't do anything. A task force, we could consider a task force. They wouldn't even pass a task force. Within a week of session ending and the legislature doing nothing, Freddie Gray happens. The body, in a CYA effort, pulls together a work group of people that they largely controlled, that nobody, I was not a part of it, nobody that was a champion for reform was a part of it. And the work group came up with, to quote my colleague Gabriel Acevero, cosmetic legislation, okay? Cosmetic legislation. It was superficial legislation. It did things like move the 10 days to 5 days, which we already know that can already be postponed. It doesn't matter. It did things like say, we can expand who can make a complaint from the individual who's usually either dead, in the hospital, or in jail, unable to make a complaint in a short amount of time. We'll extend that to a year, which is already being done with a lot of places in civilian oversight anyway. We'll make some cosmetic changes to the Police Training Commission, and a few other things. It was wholly not enough. I mean, we had proposals on the table, like significant changes to LEOBR and the Public Information Act, duty to report, duty to de-escalate. We had whistleblower protections for officers that report. We had the idea of insurance to be carried. We had a complete effort at demilitarization. All of these things were off the table and nothing really happened. And what I want people to know is that from about 2012 until now, there's been over 120 people in Maryland killed by law enforcement. These people don't make the news, and the families suffer in silence. We only know of a handful. We know of Freddie Gray and Tyrone West and Anthony Anderson and Corin Gaines. We do not know the nameless, faceless people and families that this happens to. We know Anton Black. These are rarities. Most of the people that this happens to suffer in complete silence, especially in the small and rural jurisdictions where they are in complete and utter fear of what will happen to them if they speak up.
Thank you so much for that. We're going to have a few questions at the end once we get through remarks from your other panelists. So I just want to say thank you for setting the table that this is not something people have just been thinking about recently. They've been thinking about it for a better part of a decade plus, and it's been a really difficult slog to try to get some, meaningful addressing of these issues. So I want to pivot because your name was invoked, Mr. Love, that you were part of some of those conversations from an advocate's perspective, trying to advance a conversation around more transparency and accountability. What do you think is unique about the moment we're in now, as opposed to then, and where do you think the common man's voice can be effective for change?
So I'm gonna answer that two ways. I'm gonna start by saying what it doesn't mean. So what this moment doesn't mean is that the people for whom were barriers to these reforms in the past have now come to some transformative revelation about, the nature of the problems that we've discussed, right? It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that even folks who will publicly state goodwill on this issue are going to be helpful to really getting to the root of this. What it does mean is that many of the folks who have been barriers to this kind of legislative effort have fewer places to hide. Because a big part of what I think about 2015 and 2016, I'm often reminded of Derek Bell, right, the critical race scholar, who coined the term interest convergence, right? The notion that particularly in a place like Maryland, that's a Democratic Party stronghold, you're talking about folks who want the greatest appearance of change that is least disruptive to the institutional arrangement of power that is often aligned against Black people in this, in this context, law enforcement. So I would say what we can do is, it's going to be very important for the public to be very involved in holding their legislators accountable. you know, the General Assembly is not a highly democratic place. It's very leadership driven. So it's going to be very important that people hold leadership accountable and be big supporters of the champions of law enforcement that are going to be pushing for these efforts. And I'll say it for, you know, the three legislators that are on the screen now, I'll say it kind of on your behalf. There are lots of times when I know, in you doing the good work that you're doing, that there are going to be people that are going to try to undermine your work to try to push forward the things that the public overwhelmingly wants. And so I think it's going to be very, what this moment means is that the public now has a much greater opportunity to provide you all the cover necessary to go and make the legislative changes that the general public overwhelmingly wants.
Thank you, Mr. Love. Chairman Barron.
Thank you, Chair Smith. Mr. McMillan, you mentioned the President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. I wonder if you could give us a little more information about that. It seems to me, you know, we had some leadership on this subject, at least generally, from as high as you can go. You know, the White House. Talk to us about that task force, the report, and whether the statute we're talking about, whether the Maryland Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights is consistent with President Obama's 21st century task force report and recommendations. I think you need to unmute.
There we go. The task force came together about near the end of 2014 with the rollout of the report sometime around the early spring time of 2015. It was comprised of several commissioners. Those commissioners were principally from the law enforcement community, some civil rights community entities, some activists, made up that panel of 10 to 11 commissioners. And they did listening sessions across the United States. And as a part of those listening sessions, they actually identified and came up with the 6 pillars that I spoke to very early on. And then these are the areas that necessitate reforming within the criminal justice system itself, specifically within policing. And so you can look at that task force report almost like a blueprint, okay, to building a house, trying to get a house of policing in America that was more equitable. And threaded throughout that report was this issue of accountability. And so when you look at things that were going on in different communities, that's something that that resonated as the task force traveled across the country. And so President Obama, like I said, charged this task force coming back with specific codified recommendations. Well, within LEOBOR, a lot of our chiefs principally accepted those recommendations for their departments so that they could then integrate them into their practices itself. Well, when the Obama administration went out, the next administration really did not embrace that great piece of work that was in fact already done, and that actually had a lot of grassroots input to it from across the country. And so, quite frankly, it then it kind of done within LEOBOR. A lot of our departments still embrace that. But you do have situations like LEOBOR and other things that might bump up against it that that impact accountability within those departments. And like specifically, when I look at some of our chiefs, across the country, they feel that the LEOBR, quite frankly, is an impediment to police accountability that's seen and required in the 21st Century Policing Task Force report. Does that answer your question?
Thank you so much for that, Dr. McMillan. We have about 10 minutes left, and we have a few questions that have come up. in the Facebook chat, and some have been put into the chat here so that's easier for you to see. So I see there's a question for Senator Carter. We touched upon it a bit about there were difficulties for the public lifting their path, but as Mr. Love said, there's going to be a need for public engagement. How can the public help be involved in this conversation with you?
Thank you for the question. It's very important. So I think Davon hit the nail on the head. I think this has to be something that is very driven from the outside, and the pressure placed on the legislators with the power to make the changes to do it. I do not believe that it will come from the inside. And the pressure needs to put on the leadership. You put on the leadership because many of us know that this is a very leadership-driven institution, and also the fact that at the end of the day, those that are usually put in place, given oversight over these work groups or whatever, are often there because they're going to do the bidding of the leadership. In the past, the legislature has only listened to the voices of the FOP and the chiefs and sheriffs and law enforcement officials. They've never listened to impacted people and communities first. In fact, they haven't listened to us at all. And so we need to make sure the voices are strong with the email game, the voices are strong with the public pressure, with writing to the newspaper, writing your letters to the editor of the op-ed. And I would suggest that the narrative must be repeal the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, which I stress to you is a floor and not a ceiling. And beyond that, to find out and know who your delegates and senators are and write to them. People say call. At this point, with the technology that we have, I'm a big proponent of email, because email we know who's writing to us. We know whether they're constituents or not. It's super important. But write to your specific legislator and make this the litmus test. If you believe in this, if you believe that this is about justice and life and death, then you need to make it clear that my support of you is contingent upon how you perform and how you vote on these police reform measures, especially the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights.
I want to bring attention to listeners that in the Facebook chat is mdelect.net, so that to Senator Carter's urging, if you're not familiar with who represents you in the Maryland General Assembly, you can put in your address and get that correct information about who your senator and your delegates are. So I just want to make sure everyone listening knows to look there to look up that information. Thank you, Senator Carter. Mr. Love.
One more quick thing. I want people to know to look out for the second 2 weeks of September. The second 2 weeks of September, the Senate will hold hearings on probably anywhere between 30 and 40 bills that we will propose to reform, policing reform, many of them dealing with the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. The second half of September, dates to be announced. Thank you.
No, thank you.
I was just going to say one thing I want to add, because a lot of times conversations about police accountability are often posed in ways as being at odds with questions of public safety. And one of the things I just want to make sure that is said is that, in fact, unaccountable law enforcement agencies actually contribute to problems in the ability to effectively administer law enforcement. And again, I think the Gun Trace Task Force that Senator Carter mentioned is a great example of that. That when you think about, if you want an officer to be able to get a quality case, to be able to give it to a prosecutor and be able to put away people who are engaged in horrific acts of violence, if you have an insular law enforcement institution from which is not accountable, then it's not just its corruption, but its ineptitudes are enabled by the insularity of law enforcement from community oversight. And so I just think it's important it's not that they're in opposition to each other, but in fact are complementary to each other, that greater levels of police accountability actually help to address the issue of public safety. And I think the level of corruption that we see, we look at Baltimore City's police department and the corresponding levels of violence, I think provide ample evidence of that being the case.
Chairman Barron, is there anything you'd like to add? I see there's a question that might be best posed to Dr. McMillan.
Sure, thank you. And just to kind of double down on Love's point, speaking as a former prosecutor, it's community members who are your juries in a criminal trial, and to the extent that there's problems with your local law enforcement agents, that seeps into the community, and those members of the community end up being members of your jury. And so to the extent that people think that jury nullification, for example, is an issue, is a problem, well, it's exacerbated by uh, uh, problems of a lack of accountability and transparency in your department, which is seen by the community. And then when those community members end up as jurors or potential jurors, they have less of a reason to believe your officers in a criminal trial. So it absolutely does impact public safety in the way that Davon suggests. There's a question in the chat, Mr. McMillan, that what is happening to restore trust in policing? It seems that current events has overtaken it. I know Noble has been testifying recently, and you're here this evening with us. Can you talk about what organizations such as yours are doing on this front?
What Noble's doing is, again, trying to help frame that national discussion relative to what reforms look like. And in individual communities across this country, a variety of things are occurring. In some cases, more often than not, things are happening for the positive, but we've had a variety of things also that's playing out on TV every night, where you're seeing a disconnect between policing and communities. As an organization, Noble really understands that culture will eat policy any day, and it will eat policy for lunch any day of the week. So you really got to get to the culture of those departments, and policing has no more authorities and no less than what ultimately, as you're having this conversation tonight, the citizens provide. So to the extent those grassroots entities within communities are forcing reforms in statutes and things of that nature, it then requires the policing to come along. It was something Mr. Love said earlier a few minutes ago, where you're having this definition about community policing. What does that mean? Within communities, and to the extent that the community is involved and engaged, even sometimes with the policy formulation of a department, it's much better for that community. So there's some departments across this country where communities are actively engaged and involved with that police department as they're engaging in developing some of their misconduct investigations, citizen review boards. The LEOBR is not the law in every state in this country, okay? But most of our things, like 14 to 16 states that actually enacted it. So it's not like it was, codified by every state in the United States. So there's a lot of space so that communities can, in fact, be involved and engage with their legislatures, with their departments, in reframing what it looks like to police in America, what does accountability look like? And if citizens don't help fill in the blanks, it's going to be filled in for them, quite frankly. So I think this is a very right opportunity, to throttle down, not throttle back, relative to what communities think reforms look like. Now you have to have a definitional conversation about what defunding. I mean, what does that mean? Clearly, Noble is not suggesting, nor am I suggesting, you get rid of police departments, but you may very well have to reshape, reform them as to how those funding streams are applied and used in communities. A lot of times, police are given responsibility to a whole list of things that are not policing issues. There's somebody else's issue, but who's the only person 2, 3 o'clock in the morning that you can call and pick up the phone, other than the police and the fire department for the most part? So I think a lot's been dumped on policing that communities have to really say, okay, well, no, I don't want my police department coming to my house because of a truancy issue. Or maybe there's a mental health issue here that needs to be addressed by mental health professionals and not the police. So I think across this country, you have to look at the individual departments. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. In the Baltimore area, I believe the police department has a community policing strategy that's also a part of their overall policing strategy. And that's one of the unique things, quite frankly, that is not in a lot of strategic plans for police departments across this country, where you have a separate community policing strategy. And that strategy really should be the community, having help involved in its enactment and its development. So that's actually something that others across this country can benefit from, taking a look at how the Baltimore community policing strategy is integrated and threaded through the strategic plan, because the strategic plan is where your funding issues are also coming from. So I think there's a variety, that to be specific on that answer, there are a variety of things being done to help with trust and legitimacy, and they're being done, singularly. But Noble is just trying to give voice to the issue of accountability. We should have a registry that tracks an officer if he leaves Baltimore City, goes to Prince George's County, and he's got use of force issues, and that is never, given to the Prince George's County before he's hired. And now you've hired somebody that may have a problem. So there should be a national database that does that. There should be some national database regarding the use of force standards, with regards to those issues in this country, that heretofore they're not there.
Thank you so much, Dr. McMillan, for that. I know we're 2 minutes over, but my computer will not, erupt if we keep talking a few minutes over. So if you will indulge me a few more moments, because there were a couple of questions that we want to make sure we have. And again, thank you for spending your evening with us. So Senator Carter, one of the questions I have is about the notion that if an officer is compelled within those 5 days after a misconduct allegation of misconduct to give, a statement, there's concerns that compelling of that statement could perhaps be inadmissible. Do you want to discuss concerns that someone may raise around?
So, and the difference between administrative, I think this is getting to the difference between administrative and criminal. And so right now, eliminating the time frame doesn't do anything to change that dynamic. Right now, none of us can be compelled in a criminal case to testify. Currently, the administrative proceedings where an officer testifies, the reason that many agencies wait for the end of the criminal process is, one, to avoid that dynamic. Also, it makes it easier for them. And so I don't think changing the time frame changes that dynamic at all. And then we all the rest of us that have jobs already face that dynamic of, if we give answers or testimony at an administrative proceeding, whether or not that can be used in a criminal proceeding against us. The standard is different. Criminal is beyond a reasonable doubt. Administrative is lower. And so it's recognized by the criminal court that the standard for proving guilt in a criminal proceeding is much higher. That's already something that we are dealing with. So the time frame does not change that.
For that. I have another question that's come up. We've been talking about the statute, but we also realize that in addition to the state having a LEOBOR, there are also labor agreements that have also woven into them the same provisions. And I want to know if anyone wanted to discuss the fact that the state has a law, but there's also a secondary backstop through labor negotiations, contract negotiations that have also memorialized LEOBOR.
I will briefly state that we, the state, also have the power to legislate the confines and place restrictions on the collective bargaining agreements. And so we still have the power to govern what is negotiated in those processes. And with that, I will let whoever else wants to answer, because I don't want to monopolize unless if you want to. Davon? No?
Either way, that's cool. I was just going to say, I think the importance of that question is that I think a lot of times the the move that is made by law enforcement to push back against the reforms that we've discussed this evening, they kind of frame it in the context of workers' rights. And so I think it's important that, one of the things that's important to understand about LEOBR is that in many respects, you're talking about statutory advantages in collective bargaining, where the municipality and the collective bargaining unit don't even have to negotiate that. And one of the things that, I think makes the most sense is to let the different jurisdictions negotiate that. Part of the issue with collective bargaining is that by law, the public's not allowed to participate in that collective bargaining process. So, but I do think that there's a role in terms of the who the public elects to do the negotiation. And so a part of what that means is that it is our elected leaders who we need to pressure them in terms of what we want them to negotiate in a collective bargaining agreement. What the LEOBR does is that it removes our ability, right, as residents of our municipality to have a say in the nature of how the collective bargaining contract is negotiated and how law enforcement is administered in our communities. So I think the advocacy around repealing LEOBR, I think the alternative is let police and municipalities and let the community pressure their elected leaders on what we want the collective bargaining contracts to be.
With the qualification that the state limit some of what can be negotiated, what I'm trying to get to is that the state creates enabling legislation for these collective bargaining. The Baltimore City Police Department has collective bargaining because we passed a law that allowed them to have it. And I do believe that discipline can be extracted from what they can negotiate or the way that they deal with discipline. I do believe that we have the power to still make some controls over what the locals do in the absence of the LEOBR. And it's our responsibility to do that.
Are there any questions? I want to make sure I haven't missed anything from the people here. I think we've touched on most of it. I wanted to give everyone like their 30 seconds closing, what you want listeners to take away from this conversation in 30 seconds. And I'm not really timing that hard, but I'll give you a hard wait. We're getting near there. So I would like to give Mr. Love your opportunity.
I would say again, just thanks for this opportunity. This is really important. Like I really want to commend, Chairwoman Smith and Chairman Barron for having this conversation in a public forum for us to really talk about this. I mean, in LEOBR in particular, because I argue that it's one of the most important legislative barriers to police accountability, and it takes some guts, even in a time like this where there seems to be like public amenability even to the conversation. It takes guts to, put this conversation in public with people that are pretty unapologetic about what needs to happen to really address this issue. So I just want to commend the both of you for bringing this conversation together and, pledge my support to do whatever I can do to help push this forward.
Senator Carter, your 30 seconds.
Thank you. Ditto on thanking both of you for your leadership and for opening up this conversation. What I think is critically important is that we have to, if this is the time when the entire country is having a discussion about reimagining policing. If we don't strike now with a repeal of the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, if we allow the weakened concept of chipping away at bits and pieces of it, we miss this opportunity to take our stand and to strike. I repeat that we're in a minority of states that has it. We already know that. And my concern is that we have to take a stand that we believe in justice, fairness, equality, and equity for the constituents that we represent. It's critically important that we don't continue to send a message that we favor and revere law enforcement over and above the people that we represent. And so I say that to say that I'm making my pitch for everybody to support straight repeal of the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights and not be confused or led astray by deflections of it, like things that still need to happen, like changing policies around use of force. We need to do all of that. But I think the number one thing, the floor of all of this, is repealing the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. And so I, again, encourage everyone to speak out, post about it, read about it, learn about it, and reach out to your elected officials. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Senator Carter. And Dr. McMillan, we would like to the last word for the panel before Chairman Barron and I close.
Sure, thank you. Again, thank you for this opportunity to present Noble's perspective and my perspective on this issue. Ultimately, the decision to retain, modify, repeal LEOBR is going to be a citizen and legislative issue to make. That being said, like Noble, I believe there should be appropriate protections in place for officers acting in good faith within the law and in their official capacity. However, for such as a time as this, communities are demanding change in the area of accountability and reformation of the policing culture as we know it today. I contend we have a template in the 21st Century Policing Report that provides an outline for change and achieving accountability if we're only willing to embrace it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McMillan. I'll give my remarks and then I'll leave it to my chair, Chairman Barron from Prince George's County, to close us out. Again, I'm Stephanie Smith, delegate representing the 45th District here in Baltimore City and chair of the Baltimore City House Delegation. And I just want to say thank you to not only the panelists, but to all the people who stuck on this whole video. I was very impressed by that, asking thoughtful questions and sharing in their networks. This is a really important conversation. I want to re-emphasize that we have pinned in the chat where you can sign up for public comment for the August 6th House Police Accountability Workgroup public hearing. You must sign up between 9 a.m. tomorrow, which is Wednesday, on the 29th, and 9 p.m. Thursday, on the 30th. You'll be provided an opportunity to share your concerns, ideas around police accountability. LEOBOR is one of the topics that they are eager to hear the public share about, and you'll be provided 2 minutes to do that. So it's a very narrow window to sign up. So we just want to make sure that you also share that link in your networks to enable anyone who would like to provide comment the opportunity to do so. I know that Baltimore City and Prince George's County have had, in Prince George's County's situation, they've had a consent decree with DOJ as it relates to policing, and Baltimore City is presently experiencing their own compliance efforts with the consent decree. And our next installment in the public safety joint series will really be about what are the lessons we've learned from those past consent decrees, what are we learning in real time right now in Baltimore City, and what do we need to be doing to ensure that the outcome of these efforts, and particularly the one that's in process now, actually lead to not only more accountable police force members, but also a city that is safer, communities that are safer. So that's going to be the next installment, and we'll be promoting that thereafter. But again, I just want to say thank you to all of my colleagues in the Baltimore City delegation, staff, and the members of this panel for lifting up this very important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll be brief, and also just say thank you to my co-host, Chair Smith, and our respective staffs, our panelists who took the time this evening, and again, yes, all of you out there, members of the public who may be learning about some of this for the first time, and those of you who are very actively engaged in this issue. We know who you are. We've seen you, and hope to see even more of you with friends and family. Because the fact is, at some point, probably the rallies will die down, right? You know, we don't have our regular session until January, and you know, we have to remain active and engaged. And this has to be an ongoing discussion and conversation. We will forward you the information about the House Work Group. You will receive information about the Senate hearings that Senator Carter spoke about. I know that Delegate Washington will keep you informed about the work group in Prince George's. We have to, keep at it and keep pushing on the reforms that we believe are appropriate, and not just think it's just going to happen by magic. It's not. It's going to happen from a grassroots effort and perspective. Again, as you heard from Senator Carter, because we've seen it a lot on these issues where there's a lot of activity and then it dies down. We can't let that happen. I appreciate the kudos from Davon Love, but we're simply doing our jobs as your representatives, and making sure that we create forums that you can be educated and that you can provide input to us and other policymakers who will be making these decisions. It's going to come from you. It's going to come from you. So stay tuned. We're going to stay active. We need you to stay active. And we look forward to hearing from you in the next episode of the series.